Good morning. Today I'd like to talk about managing and designing the innovative organisation. We're going to cover a range of subjects today from structure, culture and process. There's quite a lot of material to get through, so what I'm going to do is to break it down into 5 separate parts. First is to do with providing an overview of some of the key issues around the central problems in the management of innovation. The second is around particular modes of organising, and I'm going to focus here on the work of Burns and Stalker. It's quite old work, but it's still extremely relevant, and it's still used in academic literature and informs organisations about how they might organise for innovation. The third part is around the concept of the ambidextrous organisation, and I'll explain that about what I mean by that a bit later on. But effectively, it's really about how organisations operate in more than one mode at the same time, and we'll talk a little bit about why that might be the case, why they need to do that, and in what circumstances. And we'll also look in part 3 at workspace design and the way that workspace shapes some of the ways in which individuals and organisations can be creative and innovative. We'll then shift in part 4 to start looking at the innovation process, so moving away from structure and culture to looking at the ways in which organisations organise the process of innovation. And we're going to focus in on this stage model, which is a very particular way of looking at the innovation process, and it's one that is adopted by many organisations, including Hewlett-Packard when I was there a number of years ago as an R&D engineer. And finally, we'll close the lecture, or more informal chat really, to help you through the material that I've provided online and in the course text. We'll be looking through the various alternative perspectives on the innovation process. And in particular, I want to look at what might be called the social, political and emotional dimensions of the innovation process. So moving away from this idea that we just simply focus on the stages of the innovation process, simply focusing on the project management side of the innovation process, and think more about how individuals engage with that process through their social interactions, through the political dimension of the way that we operate as individuals in organisations, but also how we respond individually, emotionally to innovation activities such as creativity or learning or the ending of a project or failure or success, those sorts of things. So we'll talk about that a bit later on. So what I'll do then is start with part 1 and provide an overview which will lead into the other parts. And you can watch this video in different ways. One is you can watch it entirely through in one go, or you can watch individual parts. It's up to you how you engage with this material. Okay, so let's move on to the first part. And this is providing, as I said, an overview for the sort of cultural and structural dimensions of the management process. And so I think the key questions that we want to address in this part are: what are the central problems in organising for innovation? How is that being conceptualised by individuals in the academic literature? And then I want to talk about a really important concept which I've probably mentioned previously in other bits and pieces of video and podcasts that I've provided for the module so far. And that's the concept of boundary spanning. Why is it important? What is it? How does it add to the innovativeness of individuals and organisations? And what are the sorts of things that shape boundary spanning activity? You know, if boundary spanning is important, what features of organisations actually shape or either help or hinder that boundary spanning activity? So we'll look a little bit at that. Okay, so let's just start with some work by an academic called Van der Ven. It's quite an old piece of work, but I think it's incredibly interesting the way that he viewed the central core problems of the innovation process in terms of its management. Now, he saw it as 4 separate problems. The first problem was a structural problem. And what he meant by that was that innovation required not only a focus on very discrete individual activities, perhaps the focusing on the development of particular components for a product or the particular elements of a service, but it also required different functions, marketing, accounting, R&D, HR, all sorts of different functions within the organisation to be involved. And so on the one hand you have all these different functions and elements of the innovation process and the innovation itself that need to be focused on. But innovation success depends on how these different bits come together. How do the different functions work together? How do the different elements or components of a product or service which are developed separately come together to make an innovation as a whole? And so one of the key problems in this, how do you manage these individual elements of the innovation process, these different individual actors and departments that are involved in innovation and in a particular project? How do you bring those different elements together to have a much more holistic notion of the innovation process and of the innovation itself? So whilst on the one hand we need to manage lots and lots of micro activities, small activities and small interactions, we also need to think about how do we see this project as a whole? How do we see it as a macro activity in which all these micro activities feed into? So this first structural problem is one of managing part-whole relationships. How do you manage all the individual parts of the innovation project, as well as how they interact with each other and come together to make the project as a whole? So the first central problem is this management of the individual parts of the innovation process and the innovation process as a whole. The second problem that Van der Ven recognized was in relation to institutional leadership, and that's the problem he saw of in providing the appropriate infrastructure within the organisation, but also beyond the organisation. But we're going to focus today on within the organisation, of providing a conducive environment for innovation. And that kind of leads on to the sort of third problem about how do you encourage individuals in an organisation to focus on the new ideas, the new needs and opportunities that are linked to the innovation process. And it's about how do you create a climate that individuals can feel encouraged and supported in their innovative and creative activities. So the human problem and the strategic problem are very interrelated. The strategic problem of creating a sort of infrastructure which might include process, structure and culture on the one hand, but also then looking at how individuals respond to that institutional developed infrastructure. And finally, Van der Ven talked about the problem of process. How do you manage ideas that emerge from all sorts of different parts of the organisation or beyond, for example with customers? How do you manage those ideas from their inception through to what he calls good currency? In other words, if it's a private sector organisation, how do you take an idea from its inception through to commercialisation, through to a product or a service that you commercialise, that you bring into the marketplace? Or if you're a public sector or charity organisation, how do you take that idea from inception right through to its bringing into use, as we discussed a little bit in the previous lecture. And this is looking at the elements of the innovation process, which we'll talk about a bit later, different stages. But it's also thinking about the implications of the social, political, emotional dynamics upon those different stages of the innovation process, which I alluded to and mentioned a few minutes ago. So I think this is quite a broad concept or conceptualization of some of the problems that we need to deal with when managing innovation, but I think it's a really useful starting point. So the structural problem of managing part-whole relationships, the strategic problem of setting out the infrastructure within the organization, which is certainly linked into an important role of leadership in organizations. Thirdly, how do you manage the attention of the humans, the employees within the organization, to get them to engage with the innovation process and to engage with creativity? And finally, how do you manage those ideas from inception through to commercialization or bringing into use? Okay, so that sets a sort of very broad scene for some of the things that I want to talk about today. And as we go through the various bits of material, we will be able to see how that links back to those central problems. One of the topics, or one of the concepts I want to talk about now, which actually links to the first of those problems, the interrelationship between the part-whole problem, the project of the innovation, is the idea of boundary spanning. Because boundary spanning is the way in which individuals interact with each other across boundaries. And these boundaries might be internal boundaries within the organisation, so there might be boundaries between teams, between functions, between divisions. But there might also be external boundaries, and those boundaries might be between different sectors, between the sector in which your organisation operates and other sectors, between different geographical regions, etc. So boundary spanning is activity and linkages and relationships that cross or transcend the boundaries within an organisation, but also across the organisational boundary to other sorts of sectors, regions, companies, etc. And so one can see, particularly if we look at the internal boundary spanning that happens between individuals in different teams, functions and divisions, we can see how that might help with this problem that Van de Ven was talking about and that I mentioned a few minutes ago. Boundary spanning is a key way in which organisations can help to engage with this management of the part-whole relationships that are required in the management of the innovation process. So boundary spanning activity is activity that occurs across a boundary within an organisation or beyond a boundary. And funnily enough, an individual that partakes in boundary spanning activity is called a boundary spanner. And a boundary spanner is simply a member within an organisation that is involved in crossing boundaries to talk to individuals in other functions, other teams, other divisions, or possibly with individuals outside of the organisation, in other organisations, in other sectors, in other regions. And what we find here is that actually in organisations it's a minority of us who are involved in boundary spanning activity. Most people in marketing tend to focus their interactions with people within marketing, and people within R&D tend to focus on their interactions with other people within R&D. And if we operate in a particular sector like information technology or agriculture, we tend to focus on our interactions with people within that sector. So what we see is that within organisations or within sectors, people tend to communicate with people who are doing activities quite similar to themselves, and that's largely because as we see from social psychology, that we tend to interact with people who are similar to ourselves, who have a similar background. And if you think about the way that marketing individuals or R&D individuals come through their careers, they take different academic subjects at college, at university. They end up speaking, if you like, different languages. The language of marketing is quite different from the language of technology and IT. And so what we end up doing is building our own cultures within these different functions or within different sectors, whereby we have very different languages and very different ways of doing things. And so as a result of that, what we tend to do is, because it's easier for us to do it, we tend to end up interacting largely with people within our own sphere, so for example within marketing. So for example, when I was working at Hewlett-Packard, although the building had two key functions within it, marketing and R&D, actually most of my communications, even though a lot of our teams were located quite close to the marketing groups, most of my interactions were with people within R&D, and the people within marketing, most of their communications were with their marketing colleagues. A small number of individuals actually are not only frequent interactors across these boundaries, so a minority of people might be good, maybe have many interactions across that boundary between marketing and R&D, but they might actually be very effective at that. So a minority of people undertake boundary spanning activity, and a minority who are actually good at this activity. And so it's actually quite important for organisations to identify who these individuals might be, or actually help individuals to learn the skills and possibly the language to be able to span boundaries. And I think certainly when I did my MBA, and hopefully you're finding the same as you do your MBA, the MBA is actually incredibly useful for building boundary spanners, because what you're doing during the MBA is you're learning the functional language of marketing, accounting, finance, human resource management, strategy, all these different functional areas you're learning the language of, that when you finish your MBA should help you to interact across those functional boundaries to people in different functions. So in a way, the MBA is quite a powerful tool for training people to be boundary spanners. And so I've talked a little bit about what boundary spanning is, the transcending of boundaries within organisations or beyond organisations. I've said who boundary spanners are. Well, they tend to be people who like to interact with people that are perhaps different from themselves, but also have the skills, perhaps the language skills, if you like. And I don't mean obviously national language, I mean languages associated with functions or sectors. People who have that kind of, who are multilingual, if you like, are good at spanning those boundaries. And people that are curious, actually, people who are curious to understand what it is that others do, are often also boundary spanners, because they're often looking to see what other people are doing in other functions, other parts of the organisation, other sectors. So I've talked a bit about boundary spanning and boundary spanners, but why is boundary spanning important? Well, it's important because on the one hand it allows us to coordinate and integrate activities within organisations, which is at the core of this part-whole problem that I was talking about a few minutes ago. But it also allows us to be flexible and responsive. So for example, if we're interacting across the organisational boundary, talking to people from academia, customers, to other companies, we're making ourselves more flexible and responsive, because we're understanding what others know and what others want, and so it allows us to be flexible and responsive. But it also allows us to be more innovative, because if we talk to people in different functions, different sectors, different organisations, we start to hear lots of things that we haven't heard before. And a few minutes ago I was saying that we tend to speak to people who are similar to us because it's easy. But if we talk to people who are similar to us, who have similar backgrounds from a similar function, we tend to hear things that we already know. So novelty doesn't come from, and innovation doesn't come from talking to people similar to us. It comes from talking to people who are dissimilar to us, who have different functional backgrounds, different sectoral backgrounds, different educational backgrounds, different national backgrounds. So diversity is really important to novelty and innovation. And so if we are spanning boundaries, we're more likely to expose ourselves to different ideas that we hadn't come across. So boundary spanning is an absolutely fundamental concept to the innovation process, because it is about us not just coordinating and integrating activities across the organization that might be associated with delivering an innovation from idea through to commercialization or into use. It doesn't also only allow us to be flexible in relation to our changes in the marketplace and within the organization and to changing customer needs, but it also, and I think this is absolutely fundamental, it also allows us to be exposed to very, very different ideas and concepts and thoughts and reflections that we may not have come across before, and certainly wouldn't if we only spoke to people who are similar to us from a similar function, or only from our organisation, or only from our sector. And what we see is that innovative organisations are very good at boundary spanning. They're very good at internal boundary spanning, so that it allows them to integrate the different activities of the innovation process to ensure that the part-whole aspect problem of innovation is solved, if you like, or resolved. But it also allows them to operate in dynamic markets. And certainly you see that boundary spanning roles are more likely to proliferate, they're more likely to be required to be more commonplace when organisations operate in very unstable, with very dynamic, very heterogeneous environments where things are constantly changing. And that's because if things are constantly changing in the environment, then organisations have to be flexible and responsive. And as I was saying a few minutes ago, that boundary spanning is important for flexibility and responsiveness. Okay then, so boundary spanning is a core concept that I want you to keep in mind throughout the course and the module. What I want to talk about now then is some of the factors and features of the organisation that shape whether boundary spanning is likely to occur or not in the organisation. I'll briefly go over these because I will start to explore these a bit more as we start looking at parts, particularly parts 2 and 3 of this lecture. So let's go through these different elements, and some of these are explored a little bit more, particularly the informal structure or the informal organisation. It's explored a bit more in the online notes. So what we see then is the formal structure can have a very positive or negative effect, can either help or hinder the boundary spanning activity within an organisation. So if you have an organisation that has a very rigid hierarchical structure, then you can see how that might reduce boundary spanning between functions, because interactions are vertical rather than horizontal between functions. Organisations that have a more matrix structure, where you have both vertical and horizontal communication, you can see how that might then encourage boundary spanning. So the formal structure and the way that the organisational chart is set up, whether, for example, it's a very hierarchical structure or whether it's perhaps a matrix structure, can either help or hinder boundary spanning within the organisation. So clearly a matrix structure is much more likely to encourage boundary spanning than a rigid hierarchical structure. In the notes I said a second ago, that's a lot more about the informal organisation, which I think would be really useful for you to reflect upon. When we're thinking about organisations and organisational structure, we tend to think about, and we tend to talk about, and we tend to see in academic courses, perhaps predominantly a focus on the organisational chart, the formal structures in the organisations. But actually, the informal structure, or the social organisation, or the informal organisation, whatever term you want to call it the social network, is incredibly important, if not at least as important as the organisational chart, particularly in relation to innovation. So when we're thinking about organisational structure, I think it's really important not just to focus on the formal structure, but also to focus on the informal structure, the social networks. And there's plenty of research, including my own, that has looked at the role of social networks in organisations, and in particular my work looked at social networks and informality in the innovation process. What we see is that informal structures are a really important supplement to the formal structures. And where cultures within organisations encourage informality and encourage the development of social networks, and possibly provide the IT through various applications to encourage social networking, because social networks could be face-to-face or it could be through social media. Organisations that encourage social networks, either explicitly or implicitly through the culture and the provision of technology, are more likely to have boundary spanning activity. Social networks that span boundaries can be incredibly powerful for the innovation process. And I mean here social networks and boundary spanning that might be within the organisation, crossing functional boundaries and divisions, but also social networks that might span organisational boundaries to other organisation sectors, etc. And one of the things that we'll look at in the next part is the level of bureaucracy. The more bureaucratic an organisation is, the more likely it is to hinder boundary spanning, because it would be very directive in the way that you are meant to interact and who you are meant to report to. So we see that organisations that are less bureaucratic, less prescriptive of how we have to behave in an organisation, the more likely we are to be able to have our activities that span boundaries. So we would like to encourage low levels of bureaucracy if we would like to encourage boundary spanning. Now, different organisations clearly have different cultures, and of course organisations themselves may well have different subcultures in different departments and divisions and functions. And organisational cultures and subcultures implicitly, sometimes explicitly, but often implicitly, either help or hinder or encourage or discourage the interaction of individuals across boundaries. Certainly when I was at Hewlett Packard, there was a lot of encouragement for us to interact informally within the organisation with other people, and that was done sometimes explicitly through various cross-functional activities, but there was also lots of social spaces, such as a canteen for lunch. There was a bar where you could have a drink after work, and there was various other social activities. So the organisational culture within the division that I worked within Hewlett Packard had a culture that did encourage this boundary spanning. But that's not always the case, and you do find that some organisations either discourage actively, or some cultures implicitly discourage or don't encourage boundary spanning. And we'll talk about that a little bit more in parts 2 and 3. The larger the organisation, what we often find is that boundary spanning is not so much discouraged, but it happens less. So as companies grow, and again I'll talk a bit about my experience at Hewlett Packard, as the company grew, what it did is it created increasing numbers of divisions, and what you find is that boundary spanning and communication is really good within a division, but very, very weak across divisions, particularly if those divisions are located in different countries such as Japan, America, France, Germany, the UK. So as a company grows, it often fragments into separate divisions, and those divisions are often located in different places. So as a company grows, what you often see is a decline in the boundary spanning between individuals in different parts of the organisation. And if you compare it to a small entrepreneurial company of maybe 10, 15, 20 people, their interaction would be incredibly complex. There'd be lots of interactions with individuals in all the different functions of the organisation. In fact, the organisational chart, or if you were to map out the interactions, would probably look like a social network. So small organisations will have lots of boundary spanning between the different individuals and the different functions. Whereas large organisations, as they grow, tend to increasingly have problems with boundary spanning, particularly between divisions, and particularly if those divisions are located in different countries. Organisation type can have an impact on boundary spanning activity, and I'll make a particular distinction here between private sector or profit type organisations and non-profit, such as the public sector or charity sector. And what we've seen, if we say compare a private sector organisation, say with a university, what we see in the university sector is that actually most of my communications for example, in the area of my research of innovation, are with individuals from outside of the university. And actually we are encouraged by the university to interact with people in industry and from other universities to help us with our collaborations, with our research. And so what we see is that in a non-profit organisation like a university, there's a really strong recognition that we can benefit from our interactions with others from other organisations. And there isn't any sense that we are somehow losing intellectual capital by telling other people what we know. So boundaries are quite porous in public sector organisations, largely because knowledge isn't seen in the same way as a kind of resource that can't be shared, because if you share that resource it will somehow lose its value. In the private sector, there's probably a much more conscious notion that knowledge is part of the capital, intellectual capital of an organisation, and if you allow that intellectual capital to spill out across the organisational boundary to other organisations, especially competitors, then that intellectual capital is going to lose its value, because if other organisations know the same things that you know, then that knowledge is going to have less value. So what we see is that, particularly at the organisational boundary, the boundary that separates the organisation from individuals in other sectors, other organisations, what we see is that organisational boundary is much more rigid, much less porous for private or profit organisations than non-profit organisations, because of the ways in which these different types of organisations might view that intellectual capital within the organisation, might view its value to the organisation, and might be concerned about that value being decreased if it is shared beyond the organisational boundary. One of the things we'll look at the end of part 3 today is the physical work environment, and the way that organisations design their workspace and their buildings can have a profound effect on the way in which we interact. And so certain types of buildings, certain types of workspace design will encourage boundary spanning, and others will discourage it, and we'll talk a little bit about that a bit later this morning. And then finally, and I'll talk about this actually also in the next couple of slides, what we see is that physical location can have a big impact on the boundary spanning activity. And despite the sort of rise in use of electronic technologies to help us communicate, actually there is still a sort of inverse relationship between the amount we communicate and the distance we are from those other individuals. And that's particularly the case if we're looking at tacit knowledge, i.e. knowledge that is very difficult to communicate and to articulate and to write down. But also knowledge and information that we may hold subconsciously, that we haven't thought about writing down. And so if we when we use electronic technologies, we often aren't open to having those serendipitous, those chance encounters with people, which I'll talk about in a second. So what we see is that boundary spanning then is a really important activity for organisations in relation to innovation. But there are a number of ways in which the organisational structure, culture, buildings, and its organisational size and type can actually impact either positively or negatively on the boundary spanning activity. And so we might want to reflect on our own organisations to see how these different things that I'm talking about and relate different features of organisations and your organisation, how might your organisation change to be able to encourage boundary spanning activities to occur. Now I just want to finish this part by talking about the example of McLaren. McLaren is, if you're not aware of this company, is a company that produces cars. It's heavily involved in Formula One, which is, I guess, its key background. And McLaren is a really interesting organisation. It's based in the UK. It used to be based in 18 different sites. And those different locations, although they were fairly close to each other, were nevertheless geographically separated by a certain amount of physical distance. Now, McLaren did something a few years ago to try and bring together all these different sites, and it produced a rather nice, actually, campus, if you like. And if you look at the picture on the left here, this is a picture of the one of the elements of the campus that they produced. This is the R&D site, and what they did was they spent a huge amount of money actually on building a single campus that brought together all the different companies, if you like, of the McLaren Group under one or two roofs. In fact, I think there's two buildings. One building is around R&D, and the other building, which is literally tens of meters away, is around manufacturing. And the bringing together of all of these different separate companies, which were based on separate sites, has been a really important way in which they've been able to promote boundary spanning by firstly co-locating all the separate businesses onto one site, and then to design a building that allows individuals to bump into each other, perhaps at lunchtime, to communicate with each other in a particular way, and we'll talk a little bit more about this a bit later. So what McLaren have tried to do through workspace design and through the co-location of the different separate companies within the McLaren Group on one side is to bring people close to each other in the expectation that they're more likely to communicate with each other. Now if we look at perhaps the picture to the right, what we have here is a set of corridors or roads that are within this building, and on each road there is different companies that are part of the McLaren Group that are located. Now they're all under the same roof, so when lunchtime comes or when people go for a coffee in this building, they by chance will bump into people from other parts of the organisation. And when you bump into people by chance and you haven't got a particular agenda for a particular meeting, then you're more likely to talk about general things, but you might also end up talking about work, and you might by chance start talking about things that you wouldn't necessarily have talked about. And so this bringing together of different people from different companies under one roof is a way of trying to promote boundary spanning, promote serendipity, promote the chance encounters that allow innovative ideas and solutions to emerge. And if we look at, this is just another picture of the same site, and it's a very nice site that McLaren had built. the circular building that is to the right of this slide is the slide is the picture of is the R&D building that I've just shown you a couple of minutes ago, and the rectangular building to the left is, I think, the manufacturing site. So a very nice campus. This looks like, with no cars there hardly, so I suspect this is before it fully opened, but this is the new single site campus for the company. Okay, so that's the end of part one, and I'll start part two now. So if you'd like to come back to this module later, that's fine. Or if you'd like to continue, that's fine too. Okay, so part two. I've set the scene in the first part in relation to looking at the general central problems of organising for innovation, and then I talked a bit about the importance of boundary spanning and the factors that shape boundary spanning, and how we might influence boundary spanning activity. What I want to do now is to drill down a little bit in a bit more detail into modes of organising. And when we're talking about different modes of organising, what we'll see is that the mode of organising that we embrace within our organisations has a profound impact on boundary spanning, whether it happens or not. But it also helps to start thinking how we might solve some of the central problems I talked about a few minutes ago, and which were originally introduced by Van der Ven. And in particular, what we see with these modes of organising that I'm going to talk about is they help us to think about the problems of managing attention, perhaps, that I talked about. How do you manage the attention, encourage the attention of individuals in relation to innovation and creativity. They certainly help us think about how we might solve that part-whole relationship problem that I talked about. And they also kind of tie into the institutional problem that I talked about leadership. What ways in which leadership can encourage innovation. So the modes of organising that I'm going to look at, although they're not explicitly trying to address those three problems that I just mentioned, the first three of the four problems mentioned by Van der Ven, we can certainly see how these different modes will either help or hinder the addressing of these three problems. The fourth problem, the managing the process, we will look at in parts 4 and 5. So the unit 3, parts 2 and 3 will help us think about the first three problems that I mentioned at the start of this lecture. So what are the questions that we want to address in this second part? Well, firstly, which modes of organising best promote innovation? And we're going to focus predominantly on a model or a mode of organising, or a typology of modes of organising originally talked about by and developed by Burns and Stalker, but we'll also talk about some others as well. Linked into that, I want to briefly talk about how organisational culture can be nurtured to encourage innovation. Now, I don't want to spend too much time talking about culture or leadership either, really, explicitly, because these were covered in a great detail by Warren and Olga in Module 1. But I do want to touch on and make links to some of the material that they would have been talking about in terms of organisational culture and leadership, and just start to make some of those links. I'm not going to spend a lot of time, as I say, but just to make some of that links back to Module 1. Okay, so sorry, I jumped a slide. Okay, so in terms of modes of organising, what I want to look at is three typologies, if you like. I'm going to predominantly focus on the first, which is one by two Scotsmen, I believe, or at least that the study they did was based in Scotland, Burns and Stalker. Now, it's an old study, but it's a study and a book that has had many editions since. I recently reviewed an article for British Journal of Management, which is a very good journal, and that was a review of the way that this model of different modes of organising had been used over the last 40, 50 years. And what we see when I did this review was not only this particular typology being used extensively over the last 50 years, but it is still used today, and probably not only is it used today, but it's probably used more today than it was 20 years ago or even 10 years ago. So this might be an old concept or an old typology, but don't think just because it's old that it's not, doesn't have utility. It still seems to have a lot of efficacy when applied to thinking about how we organise for innovation. I want to then look at some work by Cantor. She's an American academic, and although her work is presented in quite a different way, the typology she comes up with, segmentalist versus integrative, are actually quite similar to the typology of Burns and Stalker. So what we find is the segmentalist mode of organising talked about by Cantor is very similar to the mechanistic view of organising spoken about by Burns and Stalker. The integrative mode is very similar to the organic mode. So we'll talk predominantly about the mechanistic versus organic modes, which I'll talk about the details of those in a second. And we will talk a little bit about the segmentalist and integrative mode, and we'll then look at some work by Bates, and Bates' work builds on the work by Cantor. Just to say a quick note about segmentalist and integrative, because that's quite useful for thinking about the mechanism and organic mode. The term segmentalist used by Cantor is used as a way to reinforce the notion that this mode of organising is one that compartmentalises and segments the activities of the organisation into its different bits. And so what it's saying is that this mode of organising is one that breaks down organisations and actually discourages, not necessarily consciously, but certainly subconsciously, it discourages boundary spanning between those different segments. So one mode of organising, the segmentalist mode, discourages boundary spanning. In contrast to that, Cantor talks about the integrative mode, and this is modes of organising that encourage integration between the different elements and different components and different parts and functions of the organisation. And she calls this an integrative mode because it's about how individuals in different parts of the organisation communicate with each other. And this mode, the integrative mode, is one therefore that encourages boundary spanning. So Cantor's segmentalist mode of organising is one that is around the discouraging of boundary spanning, and is quite similar to the mechanistic mode. And Cantor's integrative mode is one that is concerns the integration of different parts of the organisation, and therefore encourages boundary spanning, and is, very similar to the organic mode talked about by Burns and Stalker. Okay, so let's have a little bit more look at Burns and Stalker. Now, what Burns and Stalker talk about is two dominant forms of organisation. They talk about the mechanistic mode and the organic mode. And what they do to try and distinguish between these two modes of organising is to look at a whole series of different characteristics or features of organisation. So for example, they talk about specialisation, the degree to which activities are in the organisation are broken down and separated within an organisation. Linked to this, they talk about the feature of contextualisation. Having broken down the task into specialist tasks, to what degree do individuals in the organisation abstract their goals from the organisational goals, or do they try and contextualise and link their goals, their personal goals of their own activities, to those goals of other parts of the organisation and to the organisational goals? So one can imagine that that there's a spectrum here between those organisations that that don't particularly encourage their organisations to think beyond their task and to contextualise their task, and other organisations that encourage their employees not just to think about their tasks which they're doing, but to think about how their tasks connect to other tasks in the organisation, and in particular other tasks that might be linked to the same, for example, innovation project. Linked into this again is the notion of responsibility. To what extent do individuals feel that they are only responsible for the activity that they've been told to do, or do they feel some responsibility for the way that that activity links to the success of other activities in the organisation? They talk about the feature of hierarchy, so to what degree is the structure focused on hierarchical control, or is there much more focus on perhaps horizontal interaction, a more matrix or network structure within the organisation? They look at whether organisations perceive their expertise to be dispersed around the organisation or concentrated in the top of the organisation, the top of the hierarchy. And that's linked to also to communication. To what degree does the organisation focus on top-down communication as opposed to lateral communication, communication that happens across different parts of the organisation? And to what extent does the organisational structure and culture focus on loyalty and obedience to one's superiors or to the goals of the organisation? So what Burns and Stalker did is they looked at a number of different cases of innovative company, in this case Scotland, companies in Scotland, and they looked, they came up with this set of characteristics, and then they looked at how these characteristics were different between different types of company. And what they found is two very different types: a mechanistic type of organisation where problems and activities were very broken down into very specialist functional tasks, and those were distributed around the organisation. That these tasks were then given to individuals who focus on those tasks irrespective of the broader goals of the organisation, and those individuals felt little responsibility for the task beyond their own tasks. They didn't feel any responsibility for whether their task fitted into the tasks that other people were doing. And they've also found that within this kind of mechanistic organisation, there was very hierarchical structures, so very top down, with knowledge perceived to be at the top of the organisation, communication coming very much top down, and with loyalty within the organisation by employees expected to be given, and obedience, if you like, be given to their superiors, to the managers. So they found one very category of organisation which they frequently came across was this, what they call very mechanistic mode of organising. And one can see this is a very traditional style of organising, very hierarchical, very top down, and where we see tasks very fragmented. And from the things I've just said then, and from the things I've been saying over the last half an hour or so, you can see how a mechanistic organisation would be one that doesn't really encourage and certainly doesn't help boundary spanning. So mechanistic organisations is quite a traditional form. There's still many organisations that still operate like this. I guess the classic is military organisations, but there are plenty of other organisations that organise in this way. The other sort of dominant mode of organising that Burns and Stalker found through their research was what they termed an organic mode, and this is in stark contrast to the mechanistic mode. So in the organic mode, what you see is employees not only focus on their own task, but they recognise that to do their job well, they need to be able to locate their task in the broader goals of the organisation. They need to be responsible for how their part fits with the tasks that others people are doing, particularly if they are working in a project that is an innovation project that spans different parts and projects and functions. But there's also recognition that although specialist knowledge exists within the organisation, it'll actually be spread around the organisation. It won't simply be residing in one place or another. Within this organic mode of organisation, what Burns and Stalker found is there was a much more focus on the idea that lateral structures, i.e. communication that went laterally, horizontally between different projects, divisions, functions, was a really important feature for encouraging innovation. And communication laterally was in stark contrast to the way that communication I mentioned a few minutes ago in the mechanistic organisation, which tended to be top-down. What we also see in organic modes of organisation, which Burns and Stalker talked about, was that they tend to have very flat hierarchies. So in a mechanistic organisation, you often have a very steep hierarchy with lots of levels of management, whereas in organic modes of organising, you have a much flatter hierarchy with lower levels of hierarchy, and I'm sure this is some of the things that Warren and Olga talked about in Module 1. And finally, what we see in the organic mode is a commitment to the goals of the organisation rather than obedience and loyalty simply to your manager. And I think that comes with the idea that this is not a hierarchical organisation. It's one organised around delivering particular activities rather than simply delivering subservience to one's manager. Okay, so what Burns and Stalker found through their study was that there was two key modes of organising that seemed to come out of their study. The mechanistic organisation, a very traditional style of organising, very hierarchical, tending to discourage boundary spanning, and the organic mode that was much more common in innovative organisations and certainly encourage boundary spanning between the different parts of the organisation, including between different functions and divisions and projects. Now, although Burns and Stalker provide this typology between one mode of organising versus the other mode, I don't really see this as a binary opposites. I actually see it as a spectrum, and I think it's much more useful to think of this as a spectrum, because actually there are very few organisations at these two extremes. Most organisations fall somewhere between the pure mechanistic and the pure organic. Now I'll get you to look at a case in the seminar which is far more towards the organic purity mode, but most organisations actually fall between these two extremes. And actually, if you go through the different dimensions that I've just been talking about, what you find is that some organisations might be mechanistic on some of these dimensions, or more mechanistic, and some organisations might find that they are also more organic on some of these. So actually a particular organisation, and Hewlett-Packard would be a good example, they would include, when you went down this list of different features, they would include some dimensions where they were more towards the organic end, for example around loyalty and obedience and around communication. But it might be that on other dimensions they were more mechanistic. So I think, you know, even high-tech innovative companies would be somewhere between these two extremes, and it might be that they are more mechanistic or more organic, depending on the actual dimension that we look at. Anyway, I'm going to get you to explore these different spectrums, or this approach of using a spectrum rather than binary opposites in your seminar. So anyway, I think it's much more useful to think of the Burns and Stalker as a spectrum rather than this binary opposites. But it's a useful starting point. Now, what Burns and Stalker talked about is that there is actually no single best way to organise. You know, there's nothing wrong with being organised in a mechanistic way, and there's nothing necessarily wrong in being organised in an organic way. But it does depend on what you want to achieve, and it does depend on your context. And what they found is that the organic mode worked much better in dynamic environments, and it worked where, you know, you're trying to be flexible and trying to be respond to the environment. And if you remember, the organic mode is linked to boundary spanning, and I said that boundary spanning allowed organizations to be responsive and dynamic. And so we can see how that the organic mode is good for innovation. But what we see is the mechanistic mode is not necessarily a bad mode. If you've got a mechanistic mode, it actually allows you to repeat tasks again and again in a very structured way. So a mechanistic mode can be very good for companies that want to focus on quality, that want to focus on consistency, of repeating the same service or product manufacturer in the same way again and again and again. And they're also very good and actually quite appropriate if you're operating in a very stable environment. So what Burns and Stalker found is that although there isn't one best way of managing either the organic or the mechanistic, so the mechanistic isn't necessarily better than the organic, or the organic isn't necessarily better than the mechanistic. However, they did find that each of these two different approaches were more appropriate in certain environments and for certain activities. So the mechanistic mode linked into where quality is important, where consistency is important, and where you have a stable environment. And that the organic mode is much more effective and much more important when you operate in a dynamic environment and in circumstances where your objectives are that you would like to be innovative. So the organic mode strongly connected to the innovation agenda. And this is perhaps not surprising because of the way that the organic mode is linked into boundary spanning, and boundary spanning is important for innovation. Now, I mentioned that you've got a seminar looking at applying this particular mode, these modes of organising, this particular conceptual framework, and it's going to be on a company called Valve. Valve's a very interesting company that is a platform for distributing software. They're basically a video game developer, but also a distributor for software games. And they're a medium-sized organisation, a very, very interesting organisation, because they are organised in a very particular way. And if you go on to look at the materials online, you will see some more information about the company. I've provided the internal human resource handbook, so you can have a look at that, and a few other bits and pieces. And these are the questions that I want you to look at in the seminar with, and Ro Yung will talk through this case with you. It's a really interesting case. It is at one extreme of the spectrum that I've just talked about. It'll become very clear, become very obvious which end of the spectrum, but the question is, does this particular form of organising create problems when you have it at such an extreme? There are benefits, but there are clearly potentials for disbenefits. So have a look at the cases and the case material before the seminar, and think about how you might apply this particular framework to this particular case. Okay, just a couple of things to look at then before we finish part 2. Firstly, I want to talk very briefly about the segmentalist and integrative modes of organising. And at the start of part 2, I was talking about how there was quite a large overlap between the integrative mode and the organic mode, because both of them are focusing on seeing how you integrate the different parts so that they become a whole. And actually, if you look at the Cantor text, she talks about how an integrative organisation is one that sees problems integratively, to see those problems as wholes, so that you can see how an integrative mode of organising or an organic mode of organising helps us to solve that initial problem I talked about, which was this part-whole problem linked to the innovation process. So the integrative mode, very similar to the organic mode, and Cantor, from her study of a different set of organisations, predominantly American, very innovative American companies such as Hewlett-Packard, by the way, and she found that these innovative organisations typically adopted an integrative mode. The other contrasting style that she saw was a segmentalist mode, and she was much more critical, I suspect, than Burns and Stalker were about the mechanistic mode. She very much saw the segmentalist mode as one that compartmentalised actions, events and problems, was anti-change, if you like. So she saw the segmentalist mode as a very negative mode of organising. And I think that was because her book is largely around, and her study was largely around, innovation. And she was interested in looking what encouraged or discouraged innovation. So she's quite dismissive, if you like, of the segmentalist organisation because it is anti-change, and therefore, as she sees, it prevents innovation. And the segmentalist mode, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, is very similar to the mechanistic mode. And as I mentioned, that Burns and Stalker are not so critical of the mechanistic mode, because what they see is the mechanistic mode is appropriate in certain conditions and certain activities, although they do highlight, in a way similar to Cantor, that the mechanistic mode or the segmentalist mode is not conducive to innovation and innovative activity. And if we look a little bit more detail about Cantor's work, what we see is that she starts to talk about organisational climate and also to, in a sense, elements of leadership. So she starts talking about the segmentalist mode is one that disregards new ideas, and certainly, or at least sees new ideas with suspicion. It tends to bureaucratise procedures for approval, which tends to discourage individuals being creative. It tends to tightly control activities. It tends to withhold praise, or leadership tends to hold praise within this environment, which is also then discouraging of innovation, stifles innovation. Within this kind of approach to organising, the segmentalist, the organisational climate within the segmentalist mode tends to be one that sees failure as a problem. And I've already spoken in the previous lecture about failure. You could view failure as a very positive thing if it's used in the right way, because we often learn more from failure. But if people are seen as a problem because they fail, rather than seeing failure as part of a very active process of trial and error, if people are blamed for failure, and they are disciplined for failure, then that's going to stop people being creative. Under this segmentalist organisational climate, managers are seen as those that know everything, and they tend to be climates in which people are only told what they need to know. And it's very difficult to have a broader perspective of the organisation. If you don't get told things about the organisation, if you're only told what you need to know, it's actually very difficult to contextualise how your activities fit and link to other things going on in the organisation. So you can see how a limiting of knowledge or limit to the things that you're told is going to automatically lead you to be more focused in on your own activities and ignore the activities and objectives of other parts of the organisation. So the segmentalist mode and the organisational climate that's is associated with the segmentalist mode stifles innovation. In contrast to this, Cantor talks about some of the different features of the integrative mode in relation to the organisational climate, and she mentions a number of aspects that she feels actually support innovation. So, for example, the organisational climate is one that's characterised by a culture of pride and culture of change, so encouraging of innovation. One that is clearly articulated through a shared vision. In other words, individuals can start to contextualise their own activities and connect their activities to others. But it's also one that where managers are encouraging of new ideas, they are committed to innovation, and they also provide the resources to back up that commitment so that innovation activities can occur. And part of that commitment is about accepting long-term returns, higher risks, but also that you have higher failure rates, because I mentioned that a key part of innovation is trial and error, and with trial and error naturally comes higher failure rates, higher risk. So we need managers within this environment have a very different way of thinking about risk and failure and the turnaround of returns. This kind of culture, Cantor argues, provides space for individuals to communicate openly, as well as open to ideas from many different sources. And we'll look at this idea of openness and the sourcing of ideas in the final lecture in a couple of weeks' time. Very briefly, I just want to touch on this because this is something that you would have been covered before, so I don't want to go into too much detail. But linking in some of the stuff you've probably done on leadership, taking one concept or one way of thinking about leadership, the difference between transformational leadership and transactional leadership. One can see how transactional leadership, which instills a sense of pride and faith and respect among employees, transmits a sense of overall mission, tries to treat employees as individuals, etc. You can see how that transformational leadership approach would feed into encouraging innovation within the organisation, because it's not dissimilar to the integrative organisational climate that Cantor talks about. And you can see how the transactional leadership approach, which is about rewarding individuals if they performed a contract and if they're happy with employees working with tried and tested ways, you can see how that transactional leadership approach very much ties into the kind of organisational climate that Cantor was talking about in relation to the segmentalist approach. So one can see how, if you look at some of the concepts and ideas that you had in Module 1, how they start to tie in to some of the things that I want to talk about in relation to innovation. So transformation leadership, you can see how that might encourage innovation, and how you can and feed into this organic mode and feed into this integrative mode, and you can see how the transactional leadership might feed into the segmentalist mode of Cantor and the mechanistic mode of Burns and Stalker. I just want to talk, and I've made some notes in the online materials that you can go and have a look at. Just building on the work of Cantor, an academic called Bates looked at what he called different culturalisms. And this is another way in which you might think about the culture and modes of organising within an organisation that help us think about what encourages or discourages or helps or hinders innovation. And he thought about a number of culturalisms, and by culturalisms he's talking about dimensions of culture within the organisational culture. And he was looking at what he calls switch-ons, things that promote innovation, and things which are switch-offs in relation to the culture, switch-offs being things that hinder or discourage innovation. And he came across, from his research, what he saw as 4 different cultural dimensions or culturalisms. One was to do with segmentalism, which is about the way in which an organisation either encourages or discourages interaction between different parts of the organisation. So you can see that ties very much into some of the things that I was talking about in relation to Burns and Stalker and Cantor. Conservatism, which is about the degree of risk-taking and the degree of change, acceptance of change. Isolationism, the degree to which your culture is open to ideas from outside or not. And elitism, the degree to which the culture encourages communication up and down the hierarchy. So you can see perhaps there's some overlaps here between the work of Bate, Cantor and Burns and Stalker, but this is quite an interesting framework. So let's go quickly through this then. In the first one we can see the dimension of segmentalism. We see that a culture that encourages boundary spanning or actually is going to promote innovation, and that's something that we've already talked about, and a culture that discourages functional boundaries and crossing. So those cultures that encourage functional boundaries, encourage the breaking down of tasks and activities, are going to switch off innovation. So we can either see segmentalism as something that is about breaking down boundaries, or something that is closing boundaries and setting boundaries. In relation to the dimension of conservatism, unsurprisingly, organisations that are risk-taking and non-conformist and open to change are more likely to have organisational cultures that switch on and promote innovation. And those cultures that support and support continuity with the past rather than focusing on and allowing and supporting change are more likely to hinder innovation. In relation to isolationism, we see that open cultures that encourage interaction with people from outside and different parts of the organisation, are more likely to encourage innovation, and those that promote isolationism, a closed culture, are more likely to, and therefore undervalue external expertise, are more likely to hinder innovation. And what they found is that organisations, or what he found is organisations that encourage two-way communication from the bottom to the top as well as top to the bottom, and are supported by a flatter hierarchy, which is evident, for example, in the organic mode, that is more likely to switch on innovation and promote innovation. Whereas cultures that focus communication on the vertical axis and promote top-down communication rather than bottom-up and top-down or horizontal, those tend to switch off and hinder innovation. So we can see how there's quite big overlaps between the Bates, Cantor and Burns and Stalker models, but they're all useful ways of thinking about how we frame our analysis of an organisational structure and culture and modes of organising. Just a few things to cover before we finish this part. What we see, if you want to look at particular examples, if I take my experience from Hewlett-Packard, what might a culture and leadership that supports creativity and innovation actually look like? If I think about Hewlett-Packard when I was there, they had something called the HP Way, and it had a series of characteristics which were very, very explicit and were communicated to us. So one of those was that individuals were to be treated with consideration and respect. So that's managers treating their subordinates with consideration and respect, but also each of us, even if we come from different backgrounds, different functional education, different expertise, we were expected to treat our colleagues with consideration and respect. And that's really useful for us to be able to communicate and feel comfortable with communicating with people anywhere in the organisation. They had a focus on management by objectives rather than focusing on very discrete and small tasks. They tended to focus on long-term employment and loyalty, which meant you felt comfortable and you felt that you could give loyalty back because your organisation was loyal to you. There was an emphasis on openness and communication and cooperation, so we were encouraged to communicate and cooperate and interact with people throughout the organisation as and where we felt it was required. We were also encouraged to embrace informality, so not simply to operate through the formal organisational charts and the formal team structures. We were encouraged to interact informally because there was a recognition that serendipity and luck and informality were important feeders into the sharing of knowledge and the creation and generation of new ideas. We were encouraged to communicate both vertically upwards and downwards, as well as horizontally with other other functions. There was a policy of management by wandering around, so managers wouldn't sit in separate buildings, in separate offices. They would actively come around and ask what we were doing and be interested in what we were doing and try to get an understanding of what we're doing as a way of feeding that into their thought processes of creating strategy. So they wouldn't be making plans and strategies without having a feed in from information and knowledge that was being generated further down the organisation. And they also had this idea of having a proportion of your time spent on your own projects. And that was particularly useful in R&D where I worked, because you could spend obviously most of your time working on the projects that you were told to do, but you also had time to be really innovative and creative in this proportion of time. Maybe one day every couple of weeks where you could actually focus on something that interests you, something that might lead to something very innovative and creative. So that's what an innovative structure and culture and leadership might look like in a company. So you might want to reflect on how this looks like in your own organisation and how it might be different. Okay, that's the end of part 2. I'm going to talk a little bit now about ambidextrous organisations and workspace design. This is a bit of a shorter section now, and I'll cover these 2 topics which are linked into structure and culture. So the key things I want to talk about then, the key questions are: what is an ambidextrous organisation? What might it look like? And why might an organisation organise in this way? And second, I want to look at how workspace design might promote or hinder innovation and creativity. So those are sort of 2 key questions I want to address in this part. Okay, so what do I mean by the ambidextrous organisation? In the previous part I talked about 2 types or modes of organising, the mechanistic and the organic. We could be also talking here about the integrative and the segmentalist, but I'm going to focus on the mechanistic and organic in this particular section to talk about the ambidextrous organisation. So in the previous part I talked about these 2 different modes, organisations either being mechanistic or largely mechanistic, and organic or largely towards the organic end of the spectrum. However, what we find is that when you start looking at organisations more closely, and I think about my own experience, for example, at Hewlett-Packard, and I'm sure when you start thinking about your own experience in your own organisation, what you find is that this typology is a little bit difficult to apply in some regards, because when you look at some parts of the organisation, they tend to be perhaps mechanistic. And when you look at other parts of the organisation, they tend to be perhaps organic. So when I was at Hewlett-Packard, for example, I worked in the lab, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, and the R&D lab has actually had a very organic mode of organising. However, there were other parts of the organisation in Hewlett-Packard, in particular those related to manufacturing, and I guess also to the accounting department, that were much more mechanistic than we were. So when I think about my own experience at Hewlett-Packard, yes, I can identify the organic mode, and yes, I can identify the mechanistic mode, but I can see that within the organisation we had some functions, some departments, some divisions that were actually quite organic, but other divisions, functions or departments that actually looked quite mechanistic. But reflecting on my own experience too there, I can see that if I thought more generally about Hewlett-Packard, I could see that the overall culture of the organisation was leaning very much towards the organic. So if I was to draw out Hewlett-Packard graphically, what I would probably draw is an ellipse like the one you see on the slide here, which is organic because the overall kind of mode of organising of the organisation as a whole was fairly organic. But different parts of the organisation, some units and some divisions were certainly organic, and some parts were clearly much more mechanistic, in some cases very mechanistic if they were relating to a kind of production line for producing disk drives or whatever. So the ambidextrous organisation actually is one that looks like the graphic below. An ambidextrous organisation is one that is neither mechanistic or organic, it's both. It can either be an organisation that is predominantly organic with organic and mechanistic divisions, or it could be one that has an overarching mechanistic mode of organising with some functions that are more organic. And I suspect that perhaps the military is like that. You know, the military in most countries is probably very mechanistic, but there may be certain units or divisions within that that are quite organic. So an ambidextrous organisation would look less like the graphic at the top of this slide, mechanistic versus organic, and look more like the graphic below, which is an organisation can either have an organic mode with bits and pieces within it which are mechanistic or organic, or it might be largely mechanistic with parts which are mechanistic and organic. So in other words, an ambidextrous organisation is one that embraces both the mechanistic and the organic mode of organisation, and it's called ambidextrous because essentially they're employing two modes of organising at the same time. Just like ambidextrous means to write, obviously with either hand or both hands at the same time. So the ambidextrous organisation is often associated with organisations that are actually operating simultaneously in dual mode, both modes at the same time. And we can see why they might want to do that. At Hewlett-Packard, clearly the R&D department needed to be organic because the organic mode was associated with innovation, and so they wanted the R&D department to be innovative. However, Hewlett-Packard also needed a very efficient and effective production division, and to ensure that they had consistency in product design and manufacturing of the products, that they kept costs to a minimum, that kept quality consistent and high, they need a much more mechanistic mode in that division. So we can see that there are many companies, and you might want to think about your own company, where you can see how actually, yes, they might have organic and mechanistic modes, but the chances are they operate these simultaneously in dual mode in different parts of the organisation. So the ambidextrous organisation relates in part to companies that operate in this dual mode. They're operating both modes at the same time. But they could also relate to companies that shift from one mode to another over time. Now, why might organisations shift over time? And I'll talk about that in a second. So when we're thinking about ambidextrous organisations, then we can either think about those that operate in dual mode, i.e. both modes at the same time, and that's sometimes referred to as simultaneous ambidexterity. Or we might want to think about those companies that change over time depending on different conditions in their environment or different strategies that they're employing. And you might want to think of that as being a sequential ambidexterity, because they're going for a sequence of changing from organic to mechanistic to organic to mechanistic, whereas simultaneous ambidexterity, they actually have both modes at the same time. Now, if we look at if we think about the need for being ambidextrous, I've touched on this already a little bit. We see that one reason a company might need to be sequentially ambidextrous is the instability in the environment. If you operate in a changing environment, perhaps the environment has changed from being very stable to be unstable because of disruptive innovation. You might suddenly shift from a process where you've been incrementally developing products and services to suddenly you need to be very radical in your innovation, and that would require you to be much more organic. So instability, perhaps through disruptive innovation in your environment, might require you to go for a process of being fairly mechanistic to being more organic. So it might be that the environment forces you to be sequentially ambidextrous, to shift from one mode to another. I've already mentioned the second one, which is different organisational requirements in different functional areas and activities require the organisation to actually be organised and to have different modes of organising in different functions and parts of the organisation. So simply because organisations have many different activities, and those activities have different requirements, some require you to be very consistent in your activities and therefore require bureaucracy, and others, bureaucracy is very bad, such as innovation. So we can see that in finance, in accounting, possibly in human resource management perhaps, where you have a lot of sort of HR policies, and certainly in certainly in production you might require a mechanistic mode, whereas in R&D you would want a much more organic mode. And finally, what we also see is that companies will have portfolios of products and services often. Some will be very mature and operating in very stable environments where you might have a more mechanistic mode of organizing in that division, and other divisions may be employing may have very immature products and services and may be operating in very dynamic environments and may require a much more organic mode of organizing. So there's lots of reasons why we might actually need a combination of organic and mechanistic modes of organizing, and therefore many reasons why we might need to be ambidextrous in the way that we manage and organize. So it's not really as simple as choosing whether we want to be mechanistic or organic. I won't go into too much detail here because I've put material onto the online materials for this module, and there's a short case around this transition. This company went through a kind of sequential ambidexterity. It changed from one mode to another and back again, and so it'd be quite interesting to have a look at this case in relation to sequential ambidexterity. Okay, so that's the first concept I wanted to look at in this part 3, the idea of the ambidextrous organisation. The next thing I want to talk about is workspace design, and just give you a quick overview of why workspace is important. When we see examples of innovative new companies, when we see cases of innovative new companies on the internet, for example, we often get shown pictures of really interesting and novel workspaces. So for example, this is the office at Airbnb. This is the office at Dropbox. This is the office at Facebook. This is the office at one of the offices at Google. Pixar, a very innovative organization. Urban Outfitters, another interesting looking workspace design innovative company. This looks perhaps the most interesting. Invention Land, a company that is very innovative. Now all of those are really interesting workspaces. So what are the key features of these workspaces? Well, all of these examples I've just shown you are very non-traditional workspaces, particularly the last example that looks like it's come out of Las Vegas. If you've been there, you'll know what I mean. The other dimension of difference is that they all seem to embrace openness. They all seem to have open spaces. They seem to have lots of informal spaces, lots of social spaces, places that don't look like work places, they look like social spaces. They seem to have lots of hot desking, so that you don't work in one place, you work in multiple locations. Possibly you're working in a social space one minute, at your desk at another minute, at another desk another day, perhaps in the canteen or outside the building later. What you also see from these examples is that many of the workspaces are very bright and light and fun and playful, and that's partly because these psychologically encourage us to be more creative, encourage us to be more playful in the way that we think about solutions and ideas, so that the workspace can not only help in our social interactions, but they can also help us in our psychological responses, if you like, to the way that we think. And here's another interesting example, actually, Lego. More open spaces, here's a nice top left is a slide as an alternative to going down the stairs. That looks quite interesting. We should get some of those at the University of Leicester, I think. So we can see very novel, interesting spaces at some very innovative companies, and Lego is a very innovative company, particularly within the last decade, and as a result has managed to turn around a very dire situation for itself into a very positive financial and market position. So Lego is now much more healthy than it was a few years ago, and that's partly by thinking about the way it organises in terms of its workspace, but also thinking about how it interacts with its customers and customer base through social media. And I'll talk a little bit more about that next week, in particular the Lego case. But why do companies, and particularly such innovative companies, design workspace in this way? Well, lots of different ways, really, lots of different reasons. There's evidence to suggest, we might want to look at the counter evidence in a couple of minutes, but there is evidence to suggest that these kinds of workspaces are good for employee morale and motivation. You feel important, you feel valued by these kinds of workspaces. There's a sense that these kind of workspaces, particularly with having the social space and the light, bright spaces, are good for employee well-being. They're considered to be good for productivity, and I think it might be interesting to reflect on what we mean by productivity, because one would imagine that having lots of social spaces probably isn't good for you working hard at your desk, working on a very focused activity. But if one thinks about productivity in terms of coming up with and generating ideas, one can imagine this has been a very fruitful environment. But if one links employee productivity to well-being and morale and motivation, then one could see then this relationship between this kind of workspace design and productivity. There is all sorts of evidence to suggest this kind of environment is actually quite efficient for state space, because although there's social spaces, there is also lots of hot desking, and so actually you can use different parts of the space for different activities, and you can also use hot desking. And so that although it might look inefficient, there are certain efficiencies that come with this approach. For me, perhaps the most interesting is that this kind of workspace is really encouraging of creativity and innovation, because it creates a creative space, encourages us to be creative in the way that we think. It helps us think out of the box. If we are operating in creative environments and stimulating environments, we're more likely to be creative. But one of the most interesting things for me is that these workspaces encourage boundary spanning. The social spaces, the way that the different types of location of these different workspaces, and the way that people are conduited through different parts of the organisation by the location of the staircases and entrances. These spaces are often very carefully designed to encourage us to bump into each other, to encourage us to sit down and talk to people socially, so that they're encouraging us to have collisions of unintended meetings, so that we then have serendipitous conversations that we haven't planned. And when we don't plan things, we talk about things we haven't planned, and we often end up talking about things we hadn't thought about. So these spaces can be really useful, having the social space, having the spaces to collide with people in ways that we hadn't anticipated. So these unintended consequences can lead to very interesting and unintended creativity and innovation. So these workspaces are very good for creating boundary spanning, informality and serendipity, and I'll talk about some of these later. But we also need to think about how it, in particular, it focuses on creativity and innovation in a bit more detail. So it creates an inspiring environment by reinforcing the climate created by managers. So you want to, if you're getting a very positive, creative climate created by the organisation, by leadership, you also want a kind of building and workspace that actually kind of matches that too. So the right kind of workspace can create the right climate for inspiration. It can encourage experimentation through play, and I showed you the slide in relation to Lego, and so that playfulness can help us be more open to experimentation in the way that we think and undertake our activities, and the way that we look for solutions, and the solutions that we might think are appropriate. It leads to chance interactions, helps us build social connections, because we're through those chance interactions, and therefore helps us to build boundary spanning links between individuals in other teams and other functions, and also encourages this informality, so that we come up with unplanned ideas and outcomes. So this is the sort of connections that I want you to make between workspace and creativity and innovation. But you might have other thoughts too about how you think workspace might be encouraging of innovation and creativity from your own experience, from your own organisation. However, I think it's also to note that there are some people that see issues in this kind of organising, and I'll just talk about very briefly through some of these articles which you can follow up on. Some of these articles that talk about the disadvantages of these work environments. So this is an interesting article that talks about how these open space offices might be good for certain types of individual, but actually this one talks about introverts as opposed to extroverts having a really hard time operating in such open plan offices. And that's because organisations aren't necessarily full of extroverts, and extroverts might want to operate in quite a different environment to introverts, who might want more quiet, more space which is more isolated. Another article which is interesting, I think it's in the Financial Times, again saying how introverts find this a difficult thing. And so there's a number of different articles that you might want to follow up where you can see that there are implications of the way that we organise and through workspace design. A really interesting article here was how the very notion that actually, although Google is often presented this panacea for the way that they organise and the way that we should organise for innovation, there is a strong sense that actually the open office promoted by Google is actually destroying the workplace, and so this article talks a little bit about that. And these are some perhaps alternatives to the way that we might think about organising and workspace design. So it might be, yes, we can have these open plans, but perhaps we should also think about having quiet spaces and spaces where perhaps introverts might feel a bit more comfortable. Because what we want in organisations is diversity, and if we're going to have diverse organisations, clearly we need people who are on all sorts of points of the spectrum, from very extrovert to very introvert. So when we're thinking about workspace, there's clearly a whole set of dilemmas that we need to consider. It isn't just simply let's copy Google, let's copy Airbnb and have these nice flash colourful open spaces. There are clearly some dilemmas that we need to think about in relation to innovation and workspace. So there's the dilemma between how much of a space should be open and closed, how much should be workspace, very clearly workspace, and how much should be more social space, how much should be focused on person-specific requirements and that on task-specific workspaces, how much should we focus on stability, i.e. individuals having their own desk where they can stamp their identity, or enforcing mobility and flexibility through, for example, hot desking. And how much should we focus on individual preferences for organising and workspace design in relation to organisational effectiveness, and how are these two things related? So I think workspace design is a really interesting emergent area in the field of innovation. I don't think we know anywhere near to knowing what the right answers are, but I think there's quite an interesting debate going on about what works and what doesn't work. Okay, so that's the end of the third part, and I want to talk about the fourth part, which is on process. And the fourth and fifth part is a bit shorter than the first three parts of the lecture, and I want to focus now on process. So in part 4, I want to focus on the typical stage of the innovation process. I'm going to be talking about the new product development process, but I also want to talk about the way in which services are developed relative to products. So what we'll find is that when we're talking about the product development process, we often use the term NPD, new product development process. And when we're talking about services, we often talk about NSD, the new service development process. So if you hear the terms NPD, it's about new product development process. And if you hear the term NSD, it's referring to the new service development process. So look at the different stages and look at whether products and services are similar or different. I think a good starting point is to think about the notion of an innovation process in its very sort of broadest terms. And what we find is that the literature talks about the need to think about particular routines that allow us to repeat the successes of being innovative. And so Tid talks, and Tid and colleague talk about whilst it's relatively easy and simple to succeed once, what we need to be able to do is to repeat that performance consistently. So they argue that to organize innovation so that we are more likely to succeed again and again and again, we need to think about what are the best ways to organize, what are the routines that we are required to have to allow us to be successful again and again. So basically what they're arguing for is that we need to ensure that we have a well thought through set of activities and stages and processes that allow us to be innovative, and to allow us, when we set up a project, innovation project, that allow us to go through a set of stages and activities that are more likely to lead to success. And what Tid also talks about, Tid and colleagues also talk about, is not only do we need to think about what those routines might be that lead to a successful project emerging from an idea, but also that these routines are often very sector specific and very firm specific, and so they will vary between organisation and organisation, and they'll vary between sector and sector. So innovation routines is something that we need to think about. What are the activities and processes and routines that lead to successful innovation? Now, although Tid and et al. Talk about the necessity to have very firm specific and sector specific innovation routines, they nevertheless argue, and quite rightly I think, that we can learn from what other companies do. We can learn from what worked well for them, we can learn from what has worked less well. And having learned from them, we need to find in our own organisations the way in which we can organise our innovation activities that fit our own culture, our own structure, our own sector. So what some Tid and et al. Are stressing at this kind of broadest level is that we need to think about carefully about the activities and routines and processes that lead to successful innovation, that we need to recognise that they will be specific and particular to our own organisation and sector, but that we can learn from others. And I think what I want to do over the next few minutes is talk a little bit about what the innovation literature tells about the innovation process in terms of routines and activities. And this will give us a starting point to think about how we might then, how companies in general organise, and how we might want to think about organising. And I'm sure in your own organisations you will particularly if you're working in a product as opposed to a service orientated organisation, you will be very aware of perhaps some of the activities and some of the routines and some of the processes that you have to take an idea from in this inception through to commercialization or use. Okay, so what I want to start with then is what's called a stage model. Kotler, who is a marketeer, talked a lot about this, has talked a lot about this over the years, and has produced many different versions of it. And you'll see that this is breaks down the innovation process into a set of activities or subroutines that need to be achieved in order for the process to be successful. So one way of starting to think about innovation process and innovation routines and how we might set up a successful process is to think about the different activities, and then to think about how those different activities link to each other. So in this stage model, and it's called the stage model because Kotler has identified a number of stages, in this case 8, and he's looked at identifying the different stages and how you have to get through a particular stage or level before you move to the next. So stage 1 is idea generation, but you can only move to stage 2, idea screening, if you have an idea that is worth considering. If not, the idea gets dropped. At the second stage, the idea screening stage, you see that you start to ask questions about, is that idea compatible with the company's objectives, strategies and resources? If it isn't, you drop it. If it is, then you move on to the next stage. Can we develop a good concept? So what this model is trying to do is to identify a number of stages or activities or subroutines in the innovation process. But it's also doing something else. It's linking one stage to the next, one routine to the next, by effectively putting in what's called a stage gate. And a stage gate is essentially, does this idea or does this activity, is it ready to move to the next stage? And if it's not, then we drop it or we keep within this stage. And so this model in front of you here now has two key elements, which are a number of elements, but two key elements that I want to talk about. Firstly, it identifies a number of different stages, and secondly, it introduces this idea of stage gates, the idea that you've got to meet a certain threshold before you move from one stage to the next stage. I'm sure many of you will have seen similar things in your own organisations, and they will have different numbers of stages, and they will have different labelling of those stages. And for example, this is from another textbook, and it's looking at it's relating to innovation processes within more complex products and organisations, and you can see what they've done here is to take that first stage of the Kotler model I've just shown you and broken it down into a whole plethora of sub-stages and sub-activities. So we can see that different organisations and different representations within the academic literature can actually make this stage model incredibly complex, with many sub-activities and sub-routines and many stage gates in it. So the simplistic version, in terms of the conceptual way of thinking about this, is I think quite nicely presented by Kotler by showing the different stages and there's different gates, stage gates. But many companies and many textbooks will show much more sophisticated and much more detailed breaking down of that process, which may be useful for some organisations and may be too complex and convoluted for other organisations. So it might be that we can see, for example, the product development stage broken down into all these sub-stages itself. I mentioned stage gates, and just to say a little bit more about those. A stage gate is basically a yes, no, continue or go, drop. So a continue or drop or go or no go, a decision point. And so what you'll see that in the stage model, there will be a series of stage gates where there are decision points where you decide whether to move from one stage to the next if that particular innovation or idea has reached a certain level of performance or has met certain criteria. And to move through a stage gate requires a collection of specific information that allow the evaluation of that particular idea or innovation at that particular stage to be measured against a set of specific criteria. And obviously selecting the right criteria to measure the performance of that idea or that innovation at that particular stage is really important. So you need to select the right criteria to evaluate the performance of an idea or innovation if managers are to make the right decisions. So it's not just about identifying all the activities, it's about selecting also the right criteria for deciding whether to proceed or to stop or to continue in your current stage and try and work out how to solve the problem so that you can meet those criteria. So the right criteria for passing through the stage gate are just as important as the stage gates themselves. And the stage gate approach is all about providing a systematic screening and monitoring of the progression of an idea or innovation through the NPD or NSD process. And it's all therefore about improving the management of risk through the life of the project, and ensuring that resource isn't wasted by proceeding to the next stage when the idea is not really worth pursuing, or the innovation or the idea is not ready to proceed. So the stage gate model is a useful overlay onto the stage. The stage gates are a useful overlay onto the different stages of the stage model that we saw earlier. Fuzzy gates are a kind of an enhancement of the stage gate. The stage gate is either a yes, no, and the fuzzy gate is a kind of conditional go. If, for example, if there's a number of criteria that have to be met before you move from stage 1 to stage 2, it might be of, say, those 10 criteria, 5 are considered to be more important than others, and it might be as long as you meet the top 5 criteria for progressing, then it's okay that you progress even if the other 5, which are less important, haven't yet been met. So it gives more fluidity to the process, and it allows the overlapping of stages. But there are clearly advantages and disadvantages to the fuzzy gate. So the fuzzy gate approach allows conditional proceeding of an innovation or an idea, but it does, by its very nature, increase the risk, because you're proceeding to the next stage before the innovation or the idea is really 100% ready to go. So there are advantages and disadvantages of this fuzzy gate approach. I won't go through all of this today because we're going to look at the sources of ideas tomorrow, but we can see that there are lots of processes around idea generation, lots of ways in which we can create new ideas, and this is part of the second stage, the first stage of the innovation process that Kotler talked about. Idea screening, there's all sorts of different techniques, and I'll talk a bit more about them in the online material, the different ways in which you can screen ideas. It might be that you want to evaluate an idea in relation to the degree to which it lies at the frontier of the market. If you're a first-to-market organisation, which we talked about in the last lecture, what you want to do is select ideas that keep you at that frontier. It might be that a key part of your idea screening is looking at the risk, and it might be that you're risk averse, or it might be you're comfortable with risk, or it might be you're concerned with cost risks or reputational risks. So your risk analysis could be a key part of idea screening. It could be that you evaluate it through the customers. You might be that a key part of your idea screening is whether customers value that idea or not. And it could be that actually you don't evaluate that idea in isolation, you evaluate that model through a portfolio. So it might be that you are risk averse, but it's okay within a portfolio model to have 1 or 2 or a small proportion of your innovations as more risky. So when we're screening our ideas, we might want to ensure that we don't just look at the idea in isolation, but we think of the idea as part of a broader portfolio of offerings of the organisation. And so therefore we're measuring novelty and risk at the level of the portfolio, not just at the level of the idea. And you'll see that actually organisations will probably use a range of different idea screening techniques, and will use a variety of checklists and scoring models. And you might want to reflect on whether your company uses any of these and which of these it uses. And if it doesn't use some of these, whether it could use some of these approaches. And as you move into product development or service development, you start trying to flesh out the requirements into a more specific specifications, try and then solve problems to realize those technical specifications, to come up with solutions, and using those solutions to come up with developing prototype products and services which you can then test. So obviously product development and service development is a key component of the innovation process. I'm not going to go into the details of these stages in the lecture. I just want to signpost the different stages. There's lots more material in the book chapters, particularly on chapter 8 of the course text for the innovation process. But I just want to sort of signal some of the key processes that you need to think about. So far, most of the literature in the innovation textbooks and research is around product innovation. So much of the innovation literature focuses on the new product development process, i.e. the process which organizations can use to create tangible products. And the question is, given there is a lot less research on the new service development process, can we simply take that knowledge about product development process and overlay it into service development process? If we go and look at service organizations, and those of you that work in a service organization will be able to reflect on your own practices and routines and processes for innovation in your organization, and you'll be able to feed that back in the seminar in a few weeks' time on the service innovation process. What we see is that the development processes that we see in the literature are very, very geared towards mass production, near identical goods. And so we almost have a sort of assembly line mentality to the product development process. But I think when we think about services, and we think about service organizations, and when we start to look at examples of services, what we see is that the service development process is quite different from the product development process. And what we see when we start looking at service companies is they often have a much more ad hoc, dynamic way of developing products. It is often more likely to be driven by customers and involving customers than product development. And so the evidence that we seem to, even though there is little academic work actually on relative to the product development process on the new service development process, what we do know is that the service development process is much more ad hoc, and that within services there are advantages for the process being more ad hoc. Now, in the case that we're going to look at in a couple of weeks' time, I want to look at the R&D or the new product development process or new service development process within the Bank of America. The Bank of America has had a really interesting experiment. It basically tried to take a very rigid product development process and to try and apply it to intangible intangible services, and to develop services, to see if you could use a very structured product development process to develop services. Because in the past it had used, like many other service companies, a much more fluid, dynamic, ad hoc process for developing services. So I want you to think about your own experience, but also have a look at this case to reflect on to what extent can we take a very rigid product development process, which can work very well for product development, to see if it can be applied in the service context, where the anecdotal evidence is that it's much more difficult to have such a rigid, formulaic process of innovating services. Okay, so that's just a very brief overview of the innovation process. There's a lot more material in the readings and online, but that's just to get you to think about some of the key issues around managing and organising innovation in relation to process. And what I want to do now is just finish in part 5 looking at alternative perspectives of the innovation process. And the key questions to ask here are, what are the key stages of innovation or key features of the innovation process? And can we move beyond those simple stage models? So do these stage models best reflect the typical process of innovation, and can we think differently about that? The second thing I want to look at is what insights and implications emerge when we start to view innovation from different perspectives, so from a social, political or emotional process perspective rather than simply as a project management perspective. So the first question is really about, can we critique the stage model process? And the second is, can we offer some other perspectives to help us in that critique? So the stage model I talked about in part 4 was very much from a project management perspective. Very much we're pushing people who are clearly involved in the innovation process, but focusing on process rather than people, focusing on activities and tasks rather than people. And so the stage model process and much of the work around the new development, the NPD process and the NSD process is from a project management perspective. It's all about looking at activities around project selection, around the allocation of limited resources, because it's about idea selection, about going or continuing with or dropping ideas at different stages. It's about the monitoring and signing off of innovation and ideas at the different stage gates. And it also includes post-project evaluation, measuring the success and trying to learn from successes as well as failures. So the whole of the innovation process literature and certainly the way that we think about innovation process and the NPD and NSD process is very much around project management and from a project management perspective. And it clearly has an important part to play because managing risk, managing resource, evaluation, monitoring and allocating limited resources, all of these are really important management concerns. So I wouldn't want to say and dismiss the project management perspective. What I would like to say is that the project management perspective is only one of a number of perspectives that I think are worth us reflecting upon. Now, I guess the first stage is to think about what are the problems with the existing stage model approach. Well, firstly, I think we have to be really careful adopting a single stage model. So whether we go with the stage model or not, we have to be very aware that the routines that we select and the stage model that we select and all the activities within that can't simply be taken off the shelf or from textbook. We have to evolve that and to make it specific to our organisation. But what we find is when we start to look at the innovation process, there's huge differences between sectors. And in particular, as I've alluded to and started to talk about, and as you'll see when you come to the seminar after the one next, you'll see that the NPD process starts to break down when we start to look at services where it's much more ad hoc and perhaps required to be much more ad hoc. I'd be interested to hear about your own experiences in relation to whether you feel it has to be or needs to be ad hoc, or whether it can be much more structured. But what we see is actually there are huge variations in the applicability of the stage model to different sectors. Some sectors it might work very well, and some types of products and services it might work much less well. However, what we need to remember is that the stage model of innovation, whilst it is a useful way of conceptualizing the innovation process and for identifying the different activities and making us think what the different activities might be, what the different stage gates might be, and what the criteria for passing through a stage gate might be. We have to remember these are the stage gate model, and any variation of it is an ideal, and it overemphasizes rationality. And it over-rationalizing rationality, emphasizing rationality, it underplays people and underplays the way that people operate within organizations in terms of particularly the politics that goes on in organizations. But also, I think the rationality and ideal design of the innovation process through the MPD underestimates the fact that innovation and creativity are often an iterative, complex, messy, non-linear process. And Van der Ven, who I talked about a little bit earlier today, thinks that, and I think I would agree in many regards, that the metaphor of the journey is a much more appropriate way of thinking about the way that creativity and innovation emerge. So on the one hand, we have the stage model with its rationality and its simplicity, and on the other, innovation that can be incredibly messy. And actually, you can imagine that the stage model and its simplicity might help to kind of reduce some of that messiness and reduce some of that complexity. But we don't want it to kill all that messiness and all of that complexity, otherwise it might kill the things that actually allow us to be innovative and creative. So there is a tension between getting an ideal stage model that helps us project manage and thinking about the way that innovation and creativity often proceed and often need to proceed, because the way that we innovate and create and are creative is not easy and simple and linear. So that there's a kind of tension there between trying to get something that allows us to manage projects and trying to get something that allows us to be creative and innovative, and trying to think whether metaphors such as jazz improvisation and journey are useful or not. And I think there is a tension there, because jazz is not something you can easily manage. So one metaphor is pulling us away into things that are difficult to manage, and the stage model is pulling us towards things that are easier to manage. And innovation needs to come somewhere in that spectrum. But some have argued that actually innovation is a process that can't be planned, it can't be controlled, and actually metaphors like fermentation are a much more appropriate way of thinking about the innovation process, that innovation is something that advances through bubbling, intuitive, tumultuous processes, which Quint says is much more akin to the fermentation vat. And that would almost dismiss the idea that we can even have a stage model approach, or that a stage model approach is even useful. I mean, I think that's probably pushing it too far. I think we do need some kind of way of project managing, but we also need to recognize this messiness, this complexity, this fact that often innovation is not linear, that it may well be intuitive and tumultuous. So we need to find a way of grappling with that as project managers. Okay, so in the next few minutes I just want to talk about innovation as a social process, innovation as a political process, and innovation as an emotional process before we close up this week's lecture. So innovation as a social process, well, if we start thinking about innovation and knowledge, we see that actually social interaction is really important for the transfer of tacit knowledge, i.e. that is knowledge that's not easy to write down or articulate. So this kind of knowledge is often shared by people showing people things, people doing things together, people exploring ideas together, talking with each other. Social interaction is important because knowledge is distributed in many places. It's not just simply residing in one place. So when we innovate and when we're trying to be creative, we need to share our tacit knowledge, but we need to go and seek knowledge in many places because it's distributed both around the organisation and outside of the organisation. I was talking earlier about the need to coordinate part-whole relationships. That is all part of the social process. So it is people that coordinate activities. They may use other tools to do it, but people and the social process is really important for coordinating, for therefore trying to reduce duplication, for creating common understanding. And it's a social process that is all about boundary spanning, about building trust and positive team dynamics. So when we're thinking about projects and project management and the stage model, we can't forget that alongside that project management and project managing the stages and activities, we need to think about the social process that runs alongside that and with in alliance with that, and sometimes in conflict with that. And innovation is also a political process, and it's political because organisations have limited resources, and if you've got scarce resources, you have to select between different ideas and you have to prioritise different projects. And what you find in organisations is people often defend their own ideas, people often coalesce around ideas so that you get different groups of people that support different ideas. And actually, quite often, it's not always the best idea that gets selected, it's the idea that has the most support or the most political support in the organisation. So when we're thinking about the selection of ideas, it's not always as simple as using the tools I talked about earlier. It's not always about rationality and the application of techniques. It is often about politics. And so the political side of organisations can shape the selection of ideas and the prioritisation of different projects. When we start thinking about sharing knowledge and sharing resources, actually what we're also talking about is politics, because knowledge is power, and many of us recognise that knowledge is power, and we might choose to share with some people and not with others. And therefore the sharing of tacit knowledge can become a political issue as well as a social issue, a social process. When we look at organisations and the innovation process, we can also see that individuals have their own careers, their own goals alongside those of the organisation. And I'm sure Olga and Warren talked about that in the first module. And if people have their own individual careers and goals, they might link themselves to supporting certain ideas or certain projects over others. And again, that might lead to suboptimal selection of ideas and projects. Senior managers in organisations will champion certain projects over others. That's essentially a political process. I've already mentioned that knowledge is power, but we might also think that knowledge is contestable. So it's not necessary that one person is right or one person is wrong. It might be that both people have very strong arguments, and they might both be able to contest each other's knowledge. So when we're thinking about innovation, we're also thinking about knowledge and knowledge transfer, or sharing of ideas, and all of these things involve not just a social process, but also quite often a political process with a small p. And finally, innovation and creativity is also very much an emotional process, and for any of you who have worked on R&D teams or innovation teams like I have in the past, you will know that innovation is fraught with all sorts of positive and negative emotions that run through it. Emotions such as fear, anxiety, disappointment and excitement. It's exciting to have something that works, to get a solution, to get a prototype that people are really happy with and customers are say very positive things about. But it can also be very soul destroying when you can't find a solution, when you have many disappointments and setbacks. And so when we're thinking about innovation, we need to think about the emotions that are linked to success and failure in the innovation process. There's a lot of fear and anxiety that surface when we are learning things that we don't know, when we have to reveal knowledge that we don't know. And I think we need to think about managing the emotions as project leaders as well as managing the social, political and project dimensions. So we need to think about what activities in the innovation process bring about negative emotions, things like fear and anxiety, disappointment, but also those that bring about positive emotions such as excitement, and see how we can reduce the negative and embrace the positive to promote the innovation process. And in this way that we can see team leaders have a role to play in, I guess, trying to develop psychological safety within their teams. That is, allowing them team members to feel safe. So it's safe for them to not know the solution or not to know a particular piece of knowledge. And if they feel safe, they are less likely to feel fear and anxiety. So a team manager needs to use their emotional intelligence, if you like, to create environments in their teams that allow their team members to be feel more psychologically safe. And that would help to reduce the negative emotions and perhaps help to promote the positive emotions. But what I'm trying to get across there is the idea that the innovation process is an emotional process. It isn't just a set of neutral activities. People undertake those activities and they have some very strong emotional responses to those activities when they go well and when they go badly. And so what we need to remember when we're managing teams is that emotion shapes behaviour and behaviour shapes outcomes. And so if employees have continued negative emotions, it might lead to them leaving the organisation. And there's a really interesting piece of work by Shepherd, who I think is up at Newcastle Business School still, or possibly in America, I keep getting mixed up. Shepherd has done some really interesting work on burnout from entrepreneurs who have had multiple innovation project failures, and how over time, failure upon failure upon failure, which is actually quite common in the innovation process and entrepreneurial process, about the psychological impact of that repeated negative emotions can have quite a detrimental effect. And so it's about how do managers recognise that and how can they respond to that to stop and prevent good people, intelligent people, innovative people leaving the organisation. And so this is where I think, as I mentioned a couple of minutes ago, the importance of emotional capability, psychological safety, emotional intelligence. So this is where some of those concepts could be really useful for us understanding how we might manage innovation from an emotional perspective. Okay, so I want to finish now. Quite a long lecture, about 2 hours or so. 5 parts. I hope you've been able to watch the different segments as rather than watch it all in one go, but different people would like to do different things. So these are the sort of conclusions from the first 3 parts. Firstly, that the key challenges of management innovation include managing that whole-part relationship. So innovations include lots of different activities, but to be successful you need to manage them holistically. So how do we manage those part-whole relationships, create the positive cultural environment to allow individuals to feel engaged with innovation and to allow a process that takes an idea from inception through to commercialization or to successful implementation. I talked about the importance of boundary spanning, important for allowing organizations to be flexible, responsive, and I also talked about it being really important for innovation and creativity. And I also talked about boundary spanning being absolutely central to the organic and integrative modes of organising. I said that there wasn't one best way of organising. In fact, I said that actually, although that the organic mode was linked to innovation and the integrative mode linked to innovation, and the mechanistic and segmentalist modes linked to quality, repeating and consistency of activities, i.e. organic and integrative are more linked to innovation and segmentalist and mechanistic more linked to, for example, production. But there isn't really a best way of organising. It depends on your environment and it depends on the activities you're doing. And in reality, actually most organisations operate in dual mode. And I mentioned that HP typically has a kind of overarching organic mode, and then certain functions like R&D operating in a predominantly organic mode, and others like finance and production operating in a more mechanistic mode. And what you see, organisations either can operate in dual mode or may need to oscillate between these, as the case of 3M. When you get a chance to look at that 3M case, you'll see how they oscillate between these different modes. And then in the second, the latter two sections, part 4 and 5, I talked a bit about the stage model approach, and it's useful for mapping out the activities, but it is representing a very idealized conceptualization of the innovation process, and it is over rationalizing the innovation process. Even if we have a stage, even if we take on board the importance of the stage model approach, we need to recognize it's often organization, sector and context specific. In part 5, I started to talk about moving away from the stage model approach, not dismissing it because I think it has a role to play, but it's very project management orientated, and I said that it was important also to start thinking about the political, social and emotional dimensions of the innovation process. So when we think about project management, we need to also think about the political, social and emotional aspects, not just the tasks and the activities. And the stage model tends to focus on the tasks and activities, and we need to start to overlay these or bring these two elements together. Okay, to finish off then, I guess the key readings are chapters 7 and 8, which focus on structure and culture. So chapter 7 is very interlinked with parts 1, 2 and 3 I've been talking about this morning, and chapter 8 is very much linked into parts 4. Part 5 is more linked into sections from chapter 9. So I think chapters 7 and 8 in particular are linked to this lecture, but parts of chapter 9 would be also useful, particularly for the social, political, emotional side of the innovation process. In part 4 I gave a very brief overview of the stages and gave an indication of what the stages might incorporate. There's a lot more detail about what the different stages incorporate in chapter 8. I didn't want to spend too much time talking about that today, because you can go and have a read about that in your own time. Okay, thanks very much, and I look forward to delivering the next lecture to you in a couple of weeks' time.